So if you haven't been to one of the services in which we've been doing the Holy Disruptor series, every week we take a new person throughout church history that has a holy disruptor, that has disrupted the evil and the systems that cause oppression in this world. And today's person is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because of this, we're singing hymns that were actually well known in the civil rights movement. I'm going to attempt to share 3 video clips. Let's see how it goes. I think it is important that we bring Dr. King's actual voice into the service. And also because of this sermon is going to be a little bit of a rough ride, and I am not going to apologize for that at all, because I think it's the least that we can do when we are talking about Dr. King. And we have verses like that from Amos and Galatians that we just heard. In fact, do you know what that first Bible passage reminds me of? When God says through Amos to the people of Israel, I hate and despise your tithes and offerings. That is strong language from God. I am sick of your festival days. I don't want to hear the noise of your worship music until you let justice roll down like water. That passage reminds me of the letter that Dr. King wrote while he was in the Birmingham jail. He wrote this letter to the white church that had been, like the people of God during Amos' day, engaging in cruel and blatant injustice, and then just worshiping away as if that were fine. As if there's any neighbor in this world God does not want us to love and care for. And if you've been at this church for a while, you should actually recognize it. I mean, you probably recognize it from somewhere else, but you might recognize this as the letter that one February we read the whole thing over the course of 4 or 5 children's sermons. I don't know if you remember that. You see, in 1957, Dr. King and other activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This group was created to harness the organizing power of black churches, to defeat segregation throughout the South, and to advocate for civil rights countrywide. Their methods were primarily the nonviolent protests, sit-ins, boycotts, marches. They had won the desegregation of lunch counters in schools in Atlanta by the time Dr. King had written this letter. And in 1961, they then moved on to Albany, and they lost that fight. And they had to, Albany, Georgia, I should say, and they decided to withdraw. And on the heels of this, on April 3rd, 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began a campaign against segregation and economic injustice in Birmingham, Alabama. With their marches, with their sit-ins, with their boycotts. This was actually continuing work that had been started by the students in that city, which was heavily segregated, and in which, actually, the politicians were doing their own sit-in. The politicians in Birmingham, Alabama, were not to be, forcibly removed from office until 1965, and all of them were staying put, knowing that the next generation of people was anti-segregationist. On April 10th in 1963, so that's 7 days after the campaign began, a judge issues an injunction against parading, demonstrating, boycotting, trespassing, and picketing. And then on April 12th, Dr. King and other leaders were arrested, and they were kept in 100-degree heat without edible food in awful-smelling jails. An ally did manage to smuggle in a newspaper from April 12th, which contained an article called A Call for Unity, a statement by 8 white Alabama clergymen against Dr. King and his methods. You see, there were white people who had joined and continued to join in the civil rights movement, but for the most part, the white church was either against the idea of black people having equal rights under the law and in practice, or just sitting silently by while the struggle went on. Or they were wringing their hands over the methods that disrupt the peace and the regular everyday business of white people, who are then unable to ignore the pain and the suffering happening to the people of color around them. Even though, as Amos tells us, nearly every one of the prophets tells us God rages at injustice. God cares for those who struggle and is with those who are surrounded by things that make their lives harder than they need to be. God holds all of us to high standards and wants each of us to thrive without hatred, without suspicion, without over-policing, without having to worry about fear and hatred impacting our lives. And those clergy people who published that article, pastors of churches that the book of Amos says God is sick and tired of hearing from, called Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's campaigns for desegregation unwise and untimely. Here's an excerpt from the letter from the Birmingham jail, which is Dr. King's response to this, that he penciled in the margins first of this newspaper, continued writing on scraps of paper that were smuggled in, and eventually his lawyer was allowed to give him a legal pad, and he finished it on there. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the black person, I will not say the word, great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal that you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set a timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the black person to wait for a more convenient season. Those people that Dr. King is writing about were putting their comfort above other people's need for freedom, other people's desperate need for safety and dignity and equality. And there were so many of them that they stood in the way of that freedom because they could not deal with how uncomfortable other people's pain makes them. To quote River, they did not take a breath and deal with their big feelings. Instead, they stopped wholesale social change. And instead, they blame. 10:36 a.m. And I say they, but what I really mean is we, because as a mostly white congregation, and today as all white people, we know that we are socialized to maintain order. We are socialized to always follow the law. We are socialized to not make trouble and to be quiet. We, all of us, are trained to put order above justice. We are, and it is hard to break that training. We are trained to only allow empathy as far as it doesn't disturb an orderly life. That is why we hide our brokenness from others in public, too. even at church, that keeps us lonely, is a symptom of white supremacy, and it affects every single one of us. This is how, and this is why, then as in now, in many churches, order has become God. Because true God, the true God, demands justice. And that is messy. And that is often too hard for people to face. It asks for too many sacrifices in a world that is twisted by deep roots of sin, where we as white people are trained to look the other way to the point that we actually get angry when we are confronted by the truth of injustice. We get angry at those who bear the brunt of injustice, and our politicians make them into monsters for us to fear in order to gain power for themselves. The immigrant, the black or brown person, the queer person, the person who relies on Medicaid to survive, especially if they are also one or more of the above. What we see today around us is the same system that they saw back in 1963, and it is no different from what Amos is railing against in our scripture reading today. Now, I know this has been different from my other sermons in the series. Usually we start off with a biography of the person that we are talking about. Part of it is because most people are familiar with the general outlines of Dr. King's life and work, and it's mostly, though, because of how urgent it is that I have time to say what I just said. The time is now, as it always was, but maybe more so today. But that isn't the only passage that we read today. We did not just read Amos. There's another one from Galatians that exhorts us to never tire of doing what is right. Dr. King did not tire, even though the struggle for civil rights got progressively more difficult and more complicated instead of easier with each victory that they had. And I know that must have been a movement of people who were tired. I know this because of how tired everyone who is part of the struggle for civil rights is right now, today. But they persisted. And we would not be here today, even at the point we are at, had those people before us tired of doing what is right. Had Amos tired in the first place and decided he wasn't going to go out there and rail at these people who didn't want to hear what he had to say either. Had Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition and all of the civil rights activists throughout the country gotten tired of fire hoses and dogs being used against them, gotten tired of the constant surveillance and the pushback from an angry crowd. But they persisted, even those of them that didn't make it out of the 70s, like Dr. King himself, persisted in doing what was right. See, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. That is in the segregated South. If you need a reminder, or if you maybe haven't heard yet of what that was really like and what that means, it means that black and white people were not allowed to share space, were not protected by the same laws, were not allowed to drink from the same water fountains or eat at the same lunch counters at restaurants. That is where the phrase back of the bus comes from, because that is where black people had to sit in the segregated South. The law existed to keep black folks in line and white folks in power. It also kept people of color in poverty. If this is something you're not familiar with, maybe you can think of it like this. Back then, there was no quiet part. They said all of it out loud, and that was the law of the land in many places in America. That's throughout the South in the United States. In fact, prejudice and racism and white supremacy operated in the North as well, because even though they had laws, the laws were not enforced. Martin Luther King Sr. was a man who spent his life standing up in small personal ways to the many injustices that they ran into day after day after day. He is quoted by saying to his son, that I will never accept segregation. Coming from this background, when Dr. King went to Morehouse College in New England and saw a desegregated world in action, it spurred him into action. The Baptist church in which he grew up was not known for its activism, I imagine especially in the South. And he became a minister, so he went to seminary in Connecticut and he decided to become a minister in the Presbyterian church, because there were connections to fighting for civil rights already in there. In fact, the church that he attended when he was in college was known as an abolitionist church. This is where he started to make activist connections as well. But it's not because everything was great in Connecticut, where he was in seminary. Dr. King's first sit-in was with him and 3 other seminary students at a local diner that refused to serve them. So they stayed at that lunch counter until the man went outside and got his shotgun. At first, that man wasn't even arrested. They had to use their connections to get the police to actually file a report. And this is in a state that had laws against segregation, where it was unlawful to discriminate by race. But it worked. The man was arrested and convicted, although not on the charge of racial discrimination. See, he went outside because he was afraid there was a robber, and that's why he had his shotgun. So, influenced, though, by the effectiveness of this first protest and the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. King and other activists came together to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that I have referenced before. They all together, in coordinated ways, began to make good trouble, first across the South, working on desegregation and changing laws. Rosa Parks is sometimes portrayed as acting alone, someone who was just sick and tired of it all and didn't want to move. She was actually part of the entire movement. That was done deliberately. They coordinated bus boycotts. They had marches. I would like all of you to watch Selma or a similar movie this week, so you can fill in some of the details of the work of the civil rights movements that I do not have time to go through entirely for you, but it is important for us to know this. In 1962, they called on President Kennedy to issue an executive order for countrywide civil rights as a kind of second Emancipation Proclamation. Kennedy did not do that. However, he did alert the FBI because there were communists who had joined the fight for both economic and civil liberties, which should shock no one after our last person, Dorothy Day. This is the same fight that she was engaged in. But at that time, we can definitely add communists to the list of boogeymen that was running around the United States. Because we were heading into the Cold War, and make no mistake, the USSR, or Russia, was not any friendlier back then than now. However, being a communist was a handy way to single out people who were looking for political change at that time, who were looking out for the people who were most economically disadvantaged in this country and trying to get them a way out. Because Dr. King and his whole movement were not just about changing segregation laws. They were for setting up a society in which all people could thrive. And for them, the locus was centered around the black people in the United States. They weren't just about desegregation and then the work is done. They were for workers' unions. They were for fair pay. They were for decent housing. They were for an end to the systems that oppress people in all areas of their lives. And it was hard. They had reason to be tired. This is when the FBI started their campaign of harassment, tapping phone calls and such things toward King and the other leaders in the civil rights movement. And as I said earlier, things got more, not less complicated with every victory they won, because it is clear-cut to change a segregation law, but it is more complicated to make sure that law is enforced at every level of society. In fact, it was partly the optimism that people left the 50s and 60s with that led to the riots in the 70s in cities in the North. Most of the rights that they were fighting for were successfully enacted into law with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But unrest was born because people expected that legal change would continue to produce a breaking down of racism and white supremacy and oppression, and instead it went underground where it is harder to root up. I think we all know that. And this is when more militant organizations, ones that were not formed on the principle of nonviolence, began to be formed within the civil rights movement. I thought that nonviolence was obviously not a good enough solution. We have the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, a whole history, and many groups that had started off and disagreed with Dr. King about his methods. This is why Dr. King had to start writing about riots toward the end of his life. This is where we get that quote that most of you probably have heard living in this area, if you were living in this area as far back as 2020. The riot is the voice of the unheard. Dr. King did not give up on nonviolence, but it became much more complicated. In fact, at that time, he set his sights on the war in Vietnam and spoke out against that and the ripple effects that it had on black people in America and the effects that it had on the people in Vietnam. This further alienated him. People were saying, oh, don't speak out against that. You'll be more palatable. You'll get more people on your side if you don't. But that was not Dr. King's concern. And yes, he did say that riots were a crime, but that the greater crime is the way people are forced to live by racism and white supremacy. And he warned us all that riots will persist as an enduring feature of American life until the day that that changes. It was said many times during the George Floyd uprising that a riot is a mirror. It shows back to society the violence that is perpetrated upon those who have been pushed past a certain point and can take it no more. It is hard to not get tired of doing what's right. It is hard. It is hard not to get tired in general. It was hard for the people that Paul was writing to in Galatians. It was hard for those in the civil rights movement to discern what was right and to not get tired of continuing to do it. And it is hard for us today. It is hard. But we need to keep going, and we need to keep doing what is right, because God is on the side of the oppressed. God is on the side of those who fight for justice, who live their lives in just ways from day to day. This group of people, right now, we are here today I would assume because we would never want to be part of a church that Amos would picket. We want to be a congregation that God delights in. One who is working for justice even when we're tired. Because that is what God delights in. God delights in us. God gives us the strength to keep moving forward, to keep doing what is right. That comes from the Spirit, and it comes from knowing that we are not alone, that we are part of God's reign on this earth. That reign that is here but not here yet. That salvation that has come, but we still have to wait till we can see it fully. But we will. We are part of the body of Christ. We are part of the reign of God, and God will be faithful to us. God is faithful. God's Spirit gives us the will, gives us the strength and the energy, gives us the co-conspirators to continue doing what is right. Even when we're tired. And I hope that you can all take that with you. Amen.